There is a kind of person who needs very little from you, except your reaction. Everything else is negotiable. That part isn't. The person in front of you, at the table, on the other end of the phone, across the office, needed something from you that had nothing to do with what they were actually asking for. They wanted you to react, to push back or fold, or at least show that what they said had landed somewhere inside you. And when you did, when you gave them that flicker of response, that slight tension in your jaw, that one defensive word, something in them relaxed, not because the conflict was over, because they had been fed. Most people never stop to examine that dynamic. They just live inside it, cycling between feeling manipulated and feeling guilty for noticing. A colleague takes credit for your work and waits, almost visibly, for you to say something. A partner makes a comment designed to destabilize and then watches your face. A friend goes quiet in a way that is clearly not neutral, and you find yourself working to fill the silence, to smooth it over, to earn your way back into their approval. You do it without deciding to. The pull is that automatic. What nobody talks about, and I think this is the part that actually matters, is what happens on the other side of that equation. Not what happens to you when someone keeps extracting reactions from you. What happens to them when you stop providing it? When you become not hostile, not cold, just measured, deliberate in what you return, surgical about where your attention actually goes. There is a particular kind of instability that only shows itself when the usual supply runs out. You do not create it, you do not engineer it, you simply stop feeding it, and it surfaces on its own. That deserves more than a passing thought, because it changes the whole frame of what self-possession actually means in practice. Some people walk into a room and the room knows it, not because they are loud necessarily, though sometimes they are, but because something in their posture requires acknowledgement. They position themselves where they can be seen. They speak a beat before the natural pause invites it. They ask questions that are really announcements rearranged into a question mark. You have sat across from this person at a dinner table, or in a meeting, or at a family gathering, where the seating somehow always ended up configured around them, without anyone deciding that. And here is the thing that takes a while to see clearly. It is not always unpleasant. Some of these people are genuinely entertaining. They carry energy. They tell the story better than anyone else in the room would. You find yourself glad they came, at least for the first hour. The problem is not their presence. The problem is what they do when the presence stops being registered. Watch what happens when the conversation shifts away from them. Not dramatically, just the normal drift of group talk moving from one thread to another. There is a small recalibration, a comment inserted to redirect, a laugh that arrives a half second too early, designed to pull eyes back, or on the quieter end of the same pattern, a withdrawal so pointed it functions as its own kind of demand. The absence performed loudly enough that someone will eventually ask what is wrong. Someone always does. A colleague comes to mind, no particular one, because this is not a particular person, it is a type of situation most people have lived inside. The kind of workplace dynamic where one person's mood becomes the weather. Where you find yourself mid-morning, doing a small internal calculation before you speak. Will this land well? Will this be received? Is this a good moment, or should I wait? Not because of anything that was said explicitly, because the atmosphere made the calculation necessary. That is the architecture of someone who cannot function without the room orienting toward them. And you adjusted to it so gradually, you stopped noticing you were adjusting. What is worth examining, and I am genuinely not sure this gets examined enough, is how patient this kind of person actually is in their own way. Patient in the specific sense of being willing to wait for the attention to return. They do not always push. Sometimes they simply create a tension that hums at a frequency nobody wants to address, and let it sit there, knowing that the people around them are more uncomfortable with unresolved tension than they are. It is a calculated posture, not always conscious, but calculated in effect. The question that starts to matter is not why they are like this. That is a long conversation with a lot of roots. The question that matters is simpler and more immediate. What are you doing, moment to moment, that keeps the whole thing running? Silence from the wrong person feels different from regular silence. You know this already, even if you have never put words to it. There is the silence of someone who has nothing to add, and there is the silence of someone who would normally have pushed back and didn't. Those two silences do not feel the same in the body. One is neutral, the other has a texture to it, something slightly off, like a step you expected on a staircase that turned out not to be there. Think about a relationship where disagreement had become the normal rhythm. Not hostile, not broken, just two people who had developed a pattern of friction that both of them had quietly organized their communication around. One person says something edged, the other responds. The response gets sharpened slightly. The first person sharpens back. And somewhere in that exchange, there is a strange intimacy, because at least both people are present, at least both people are engaged, at least the thing between them has heat. The friction confirmed that the other person was still there, still affected, still in contact. And then one day the edged comment arrives, and the other person just doesn't, responds to something else in the conversation, moves past it without marking it. The silence where the friction used to be is not peaceful. It is disorienting in a way that takes a moment to identify. That disorientation takes time to unpack, because it reveals something that most people would prefer not to see about themselves. The person who threw the edged comment was not looking for a fight. Or maybe they were, but that is almost beside the point. What they were looking for was confirmation that the comment had registered, that it had weight, that the other person felt it and had to respond to it. A response, even an angry one, even a defensive one, was proof of impact. And without the proof, something goes unresolved in a way that is almost physical. The comment left the room and no one caught it. I have thought about this from the other direction too, and I am not entirely sure the picture is flattering. There have been times when I provided that confirmation not because I was genuinely moved by what someone said, but because the alternative, staying composed, staying measured, letting the moment pass without a visible landing, felt somehow dishonest, like I was pretending not to be affected when I was. But looking back at some of those moments, I wonder how much of the reaction was real, and how much of it was simply the automatic response of someone who had been trained, through long repetition, to treat friction as something requiring immediate acknowledgement. The reaction had become a reflex, and reflexes do not ask for permission before they fire. There is a dynamic in certain friendships that runs on exactly this current. The friend who tests the temperature of the relationship regularly, not through warmth but through provocation, a joke that goes slightly too far, a comment about something you are sensitive about, delivered casually, as if the sensitivity were the problem and not the comment. And your response, the slight stiffening, the careful answer, the laugh that comes out a little flat, tells them what they needed to know, that you are still there, that you still care enough to be affected, that the friendship still has enough charge in it that a small current can move through. What nobody examines in that dynamic is the person on the receiving end and what they are actually providing. Every reaction is a kind of report. It tells the other person, this reached me, you have access, your words still have the ability to produce a response in me. And for someone who depends on that kind of access to feel stable in a relationship, not loved, necessarily, not respected, just present and registered, that report is not optional. It is the thing they came for. The conversation was the delivery mechanism. The reaction was the actual content. The deliberate choice not to provide that report is not cruelty. It is not strategy in the manipulative sense of the word. It is something quieter and more difficult. It is the recognition that not every provocation requires a response, and that staying composed in the face of something designed to destabilize you is one of the more honest things you can do. Honest to yourself first, because when you react automatically, you are not expressing a genuine response. You are executing a program someone else installed a long time ago. The patient refusal to execute it is not distance. It is presence of a different, more deliberate kind. And the person on the other end of that silence will feel its absence like a missing step. That is not your doing. That is just what happens when something that was always provided suddenly is not. The structure that was built on your reactions has to find another way to stand, and for a while it will be very visible that it cannot. When the first move doesn't land, most people do not stop and reconsider. They escalate. This is so consistent, it is almost mechanical. The volume goes up, the comment gets sharper, the behavior becomes harder to ignore. The person didn't decide to escalate. The absence of a response felt like a malfunction that needed to be corrected, and the volume went up on its own. A parent who makes a remark about a life choice and receives a calm, non-defensive reply will often restate the same remark louder, or with more detail, or attached to a longer history of related grievances. The original comment was not really about the life choice. It was a test of whether the connection was still live. The calm reply failed to confirm it, so the test gets repeated at higher volume. The escalation always reveals more than the original move did. When someone raises the stakes because they were not registered the first time, they are showing you exactly how much they need the registration. The composed response did not wound them. It left them without information. And the need for that information: am I still affecting this person? Do I still have access? Does my presence still produce something visible? That need does not quietly accept a non-answer. It pushes, it sharpens, it finds a new angle. What is strange and easy to misread is that the escalation looks like aggression from the outside. It presents itself as anger, or pressure, or dominance, but underneath the presentation there is something closer to a question that keeps going unanswered. The louder the question gets, the more clearly it announces its own fragility. The harder recognition, the one that tends to surface on its own, usually not during the situation, but sometime after, in the middle of something unrelated, is that the pattern only ran as long as it did because you kept it running. Not intentionally, not because you wanted to, but because every time the test came, you answered it. Every time the comment arrived looking for a response, you provided one. Every time the silence needed filling, you filled it. You were not the problem, but you were the fuel. This is the part most people skip over because it is uncomfortable in a specific way. It is not the discomfort of being wronged. It is the discomfort of realizing you had more agency in the situation than you were using. That is a different feeling entirely, and it tends to produce a defensive response in people who are otherwise self-aware. Nobody wants to hear that they participated in something that exhausted them. But participation and culpability are not the same thing, and conflating them is how people avoid looking at this clearly. Think about a dynamic at work, a colleague whose need for visible recognition shaped the entire team's communication. Meetings structured around managing their reaction to feedback. Emails carefully worded to avoid triggering a response that would then require 3 more emails to resolve. The collective energy spent not on the work but on the maintenance of one person's equilibrium. And everyone in that room had, at some point, made the calculated decision that it was easier to give them what they needed than to absorb the cost of not doing so. The decision made sense each individual time. Accumulated over months, it had built a structure none of them consciously chose. The moment of recognition I am describing is not dramatic. It does not arrive as an epiphany. It is more like noticing for the first time that you have been holding your breath in a particular room, and you only realize it when you finally step outside. You did not decide to hold your breath. You just did, because the atmosphere made it the path of least resistance. And once you notice it, you cannot unnotice it. The next time you walk into that room, you will feel the moment your breathing changes, and you will have a choice you did not have before. That choice is not between being kind and being cold. That framing is how people talk themselves back into the old pattern. The actual choice is between responding deliberately and responding automatically, between deciding what this moment warrants from you and simply executing the response that has been executed 100 times before because it was easier. Restraint, in this context, is not about withholding. It is about pausing long enough to ask whether what you are about to give is something you are choosing to give, or something that is simply being taken because you left the door open. Most people, once they see this clearly, feel a version of something between relief and embarrassment. Relief because the dynamic suddenly has a shape, and things with a shape can be worked with. Embarrassment because, well, because it went on as long as it did. Both responses are reasonable. Neither one is the point. The point is what comes after the recognition, which is the slower and more patient work of actually changing what you return. People assume the first response to withdrawn validation is anger. It is not. Anger comes later, and when it does, it is almost a relief for both people because anger at least has a clear shape, a recognizable temperature, something you can respond to or step away from. What comes first is something more revealing and harder to name. It is closer to the expression on someone's face when they reach for a light switch in a room they have used for years, and the switch is not where it used to be. Not catastrophe. Just a small wrongness, a gap where something expected was supposed to be. The original comment was not really about the life choice. It was a test of whether the connection was still live. The calm reply failed to confirm it, so the test gets repeated at higher volume. The escalation always reveals more than the original move did. When someone raises the stakes because they were not registered the first time, they are showing you exactly how much they need the registration. The composed response did not wound them. It left them without information. And the need for that information: am I still affecting this person? Do I still have access? Does my presence still produce something visible? That need does not quietly accept a non-answer. It pushes, it sharpens, it finds a new angle. What is strange and easy to misread is that the escalation looks like aggression from the outside. It presents itself as anger, or pressure, or dominance. But underneath the presentation there is something closer to a question that keeps going unanswered. The louder the question gets, the more clearly it announces its own fragility. The harder recognition, the one that tends to surface on its own, usually not during the situation but sometime after, in the middle of something unrelated, is that the pattern only ran as long as it did because you kept it running. Not intentionally, not because you wanted to, but because every time the test came, you answered it. Every time the comment arrived looking for a response, you provided one. Every time the silence needed filling, you filled it. You were not the problem, but you were the fuel. This is the part most people skip over because it is uncomfortable in a specific way. It is not the discomfort of being wronged. It is the discomfort of realizing you had more agency in the situation than you were using. That is a different feeling entirely, and it tends to produce a defensive response in people who are otherwise self-aware. Nobody wants to hear that they participated in something that exhausted them, but participation and culpability are not the same thing, and conflating them is how people avoid looking at this clearly. Think about a dynamic at work, a colleague whose need for visible recognition shaped the entire team's communication. Meetings structured around managing their reaction to feedback. Emails carefully worded to avoid triggering a response that would then require 3 more emails to resolve. The collective energy spent not on the work but on the maintenance of one person's equilibrium. And everyone in that room had, at some point, made the calculated decision that it was easier to give them what they needed than to absorb the cost of not doing so. The decision made sense each individual time, accumulated over months. It had built a structure none of them consciously chose. The moment of recognition I am describing is not dramatic. It does not arrive as an epiphany. It is more like noticing, for the first time, that you have been holding your breath in a particular room and you only realize it when you finally step outside. You did not decide to hold your breath. You just did, because the atmosphere made it the path of least resistance. And once you notice it, you cannot unnotice it. The next time you walk into that room, you will feel the moment your breathing changes, and you will have a choice you did not have before. That choice is not between being kind and being cold. That framing is how people talk themselves back into the old pattern. The actual choice is between responding deliberately and responding automatically. Between deciding what this moment warrants from you and simply executing the response that has been executed 100 times before because it was easier. Restraint, in this context, is not about withholding. It is about pausing long enough to ask whether what you are about to give is something you are choosing to give, or something that is simply being taken because you left the door open. Most people, once they see this clearly, feel a version of something between relief and embarrassment. Relief because the dynamic suddenly has a shape, and things with a shape can be worked with. Embarrassment because it went on as long as it did. Both responses are reasonable. Neither one is the point. The point is what comes after the recognition, which is the slower and more patient work of actually changing what you return. People assume the first response to withdrawn validation is anger. It is not. Anger comes later, and when it does, it is almost a relief for both people, because anger at least has a clear shape, a recognizable temperature, something you can respond to or step away from. What comes first is something more revealing and harder to name. It is closer to the expression on someone's face when they reach for a light switch in a room they have used for years, and the switch is not where it used to be. Not catastrophe, just a small wrongness, a gap where something expected was supposed to be. The person who has organized their sense of stability around the reactions of others does not experience the absence of those signals as peace. They experience it as interference. Something in their internal signal is not resolving. They sent the usual transmission, and no confirmation came back, and the system does not know what to do with that. So it keeps sending. The comment gets repeated in a slightly different form. The behavior that usually produces a response gets intensified. Not because they are consciously aware of what they are doing, most of the time they are genuinely not, but because the disorientation is uncomfortable enough that the automatic response is to try harder, to push the same button with more pressure, to assume the problem is the force applied rather than the mechanism itself. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being around someone in this state, and I want to name it carefully because I think it gets misread. It does not feel like being around someone who is angry or demanding. It feels like being around someone who is slightly off balance and looking for something to hold on to without being able to say what it is. The energy in the room is not aggressive. It is restless, searching, And because most people are wired to respond to that kind of restlessness with accommodation, because it feels like the compassionate thing, the accommodation arrives, and the restlessness settles, and neither person examines what just happened. What this reveals, if you look at it directly, is a structural fragility most people never examine. A person whose sense of self is primarily assembled from the outside, from how others respond, from whether they are noticed, from the visible proof that their presence produces effects in the people around them. That person is not unstable because something went wrong in them. They are unstable in the specific way that any structure is unstable when its load-bearing elements are external. You can build something that looks entirely solid. You can inhabit it for years and never notice the problem. But if what holds it up exists outside the structure itself, then anything that moves on the outside can move the whole thing. The structure has no way to hold itself. I have watched this most clearly in a relationship context, and I think it is where the pattern is most visible, because the proximity is closest and the stakes feel highest. Someone who needs their partner to react, to show jealousy at the right moments, to seek reassurance regularly, to demonstrate through small anxious gestures that the relationship is still primary and still organized around them, will, when those reactions stop arriving, begin to feel something they describe as being ignored or unloved. But what they are actually feeling is closer to a loss of navigation. The reactions were not just emotional warmth. They were data. They told the person where they stood, how much influence they still carried, whether the other person was still affected enough to be moved. Without the data, the position feels uncertain. And uncertain, for someone who cannot generate that certainty from inside themselves, is not uncomfortable, it is intolerable. The escalation that follows, the pointed comments, the withdrawn affection, the sudden introduction of a topic designed to produce a reaction, is not cruelty, or at least it does not start as cruelty. It is a recalibration attempt, a measured, if unconscious effort to restore the information flow. And this is the part that matters for anyone on the receiving end. The escalation is not about you. It is about the disorientation. You are not the cause of the distress. You are the person who used to resolve it automatically, and now you are not, and the system that depended on your automatic resolution is running its correction protocols. The anger, when it finally arrives, is almost secondary. It is the cover story the disorientation tells about itself once it has had time to find a more presentable form. Disorientation is vulnerable. It does not know how to present itself in public. Anger is not vulnerable. Anger has a posture, a volume, a claim. So the story becomes, you are being distant, you are being cold, something has changed in you, and whatever changed is the problem. And sometimes, more often than is comfortable to admit, the person on the receiving end of that story believes it, which is exactly how the old pattern gets reinstated. The moment you accept the framing that your composure is the problem, you have returned to providing what was withdrawn. The disorientation resolves, the system resets, the confirmation resumes, and the structure that was briefly asked to hold itself up is allowed, once again, to lean on you instead. Restraint is not the same as absence. This distinction matters more than it might seem, because most people, when they first try to stop feeding a dynamic they have identified, overcorrect. They go cold. They become clipped and distant in a way that is itself a kind of message, a performed withdrawal that the other person can read and respond to just as easily as they responded to the old reactions. The coldness is still a report. It still says, you reached me, something changed. I am now organizing my behavior around you. It is a different response, but it is still a response. Nothing underneath has changed. What actual restraint looks like in practice is harder to describe because it does not have a dramatic texture. It is not cold, and it is not warm in the performed sense. It is measured. You respond to what genuinely warrants a response, and you let the rest pass without marking it. A comment designed to destabilize gets the same quality of attention you would give to something unremarkable. Not pointed neutrality, just neutrality. You stay in the conversation. You stay present. You simply become very deliberate about what you return. There is a version of this I had to learn in a specific context, a family situation where certain conversations had a reliable shape. A topic would come up, it would be framed in a way that invited either defense or capitulation, and whichever one arrived would be used to continue. The defensive response confirmed that the topic had power. The capitulating response confirmed something else, something about the hierarchy of the relationship. What I had not tried for a long time was the patient third option, engage with the part of the conversation that was genuine and let the framing go entirely unanswered. Not ignore it, not name it, just declined to pick it up. The conversation did not know what to do with that for a while, but it eventually found a different shape. The daily practice of this is not dramatic. It is more like a small recurring decision. Someone at work makes a comment that was clearly designed to see if you would react. You notice it. You cannot not notice it once you have learned to see the pattern, and you make a surgical choice about what, if anything, it warrants. You might respond to the surface content and nothing else. You might say something brief and then let the silence sit without filling it. The decision is made consciously. That is the whole point. Conscious is the opposite of automatic, and automatic is how the pattern survived as long as it did. The composed person in a room full of escalating energy is not uninvolved. They are, in a specific way, the most involved, because they are the only one actively choosing their response rather than simply having it produced by the situation. That quality of presence is different from distance. It is patient in the way that something calibrated is patient, not waiting for the moment to end, waiting with full attention and choosing, from that attention, what belongs to them to give. Put the 6 fragments next to each other and something becomes visible that wasn't visible inside any one of them. A person who needs the room to register their presence, the discomfort of silence where a reaction used to be, the escalation that follows when the first move doesn't land, the recognition that you were the one keeping it running, the disorientation that arrives when the supply stops, the daily practice of choosing what you return. 6 different angles, one structure underneath all of them. The structure is this: attention is a resource, and like any resource, its flow can be directed, redirected, extracted, or withheld. Most people move through their relationships without examining who controls that flow or how it got arranged the way it did. They just know that certain people leave them feeling lighter and others leave them feeling like something was taken. They know that some conversations end with them having given more than they planned to give. They attribute this to personality, to chemistry, to the particular difficulty of certain relationships. What they are actually describing is an economy, and in every economy there are people who produce and people who extract, and the exchange is only fair when both parties are choosing it. The person who cannot go unnoticed, who tests the room with escalating behavior when not registered, who reorganizes in the face of someone's composed non-reaction, that person is not villainous. They are in a specific way trapped in a system that requires constant external input to maintain a sense of internal stability. That is not a comfortable way to exist. The need never gets fully satisfied because the satisfaction is structural, not personal. No single reaction, no matter how complete, resolves the underlying requirement. The supply always needs to be renewed, which means the person who depends on it is always, on some level, working, always scanning, always calculating, however unconsciously, whether the current situation is providing enough. What the deliberate withdrawal of automatic reaction does, and this is the part that requires the most careful framing, is not punish that person. It does not teach them a lesson. It does not fix anything. What it does is refuse to participate in a system that was costing you without your conscious consent. The benefit to the other person, if there is one, is secondary and uncertain. I would be overstating the case if I suggested that staying composed in the face of someone's escalation reliably produces growth in them. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it just produces more escalation, and then distance, and eventually an end. The point is not the outcome for them. The point is what it means for the economy of your own attention. Because here is what the 6 fragments were also describing, from the other direction. Every automatic confirmation you provide to someone else's need is attention that is not yours while it is being given. Your composure, your calm, your measured response, these are not cold, they are evidence that your attention belongs to you, that it is not simply available for extraction by whoever positions themselves correctly. That you have somewhere along the way stopped treating your attention as a common resource and started treating it as something you allocate deliberately. It does not announce itself, but it changes the entire texture of how you move through the interactions that used to cost you most. The people who notice it first are usually the ones who depended on the old arrangement. They will not always describe what they notice accurately. They will say you have become distant or difficult, or that something is off between you. What they are actually noticing is that the automatic current has stopped flowing. The lights are on, you are present, but the current is no longer running freely from you to them on demand. And that absence of something they never had to ask for because it was always just there, registers as a loss, even though nothing was taken. The patient refusal to be automatically available is experienced by the person who was automatically drawing from you as a kind of withdrawal, which tells you everything about how the arrangement was working. This is what the Stoic frame at its most practical actually means in a relational context. Not detachment, not the performed indifference of someone who has decided emotions are a weakness. Something much more surgical than that. The recognition that you are responsible for what you give, that not every demand on your attention is a legitimate claim, and that the most composed version of yourself is not the one who feels nothing but the one who feels clearly and chooses deliberately. The cucumber that is cut off, one of the old writers put it, does not suffer for having been separated from the vine. It simply is what it is. The idea was never about numbness, it was about sufficiency. The thing that is complete in itself does not require the vine to tell it what it is. You were never obligated to be the vine for someone else's sense of self. That was always a choice. Seeing it as a choice, that is where it starts. There is a version of you that is already doing this, partially, without having named it. You have already had moments where you let something pass that you would have previously picked up and carried. You have already felt the difference between a response you chose and a response that simply happened to you. The work is not starting from zero. It is becoming more deliberate about something you have already in fragments begun. What changes when you do this consistently? And I want to be careful here because I do not think it changes everything. And anyone who tells you it does is selling something. What actually changes is the internal texture of the interactions that used to cost you most. Not because the other person necessarily changes. Sometimes they do. Often they don't. But the cost changes. The meeting that used to leave you emptied out starts leaving you less depleted, not because it became easier, but because you stopped spending from a place you did not choose to spend from. The family dinner that used to require days of recovery starts requiring less, not because the dynamic resolved, but because you were more surgical about what you brought into it and what you left at the door. That is a modest claim. I am aware it sounds modest next to the kind of language that usually surrounds this topic, the promises of transformation, the before and after framing, the implication that one shift in perspective reorganizes everything downstream. I do not think it works that way. I think it works the way most real things work, which is slowly and unevenly, and with setbacks that feel like proof it is not working when they are actually just part of how it works. There will be a conversation, maybe soon, maybe already scheduled in your calendar, where everything you have turned over in the last 30 minutes gets tested. Someone will say the thing designed to produce the familiar response. The room will wait, and there will be a moment, not long, a few seconds at most, where you feel the old pull, the automatic readiness to answer the test, to confirm that the current still flows, to be the vine when the vine is what is wanted. That moment is not a problem. That moment is the whole point, because in that moment you will have a choice you did not always know you had. What you do with it is yours entirely, not mine, not anyone else's. You already know what the automatic response produces. You have lived the downstream of it enough times to know its shape. The deliberate response, the measured, patient, composed choice of what this moment actually warrants from you, that one you are still learning. Most people are. That is not a failure. That is just where the work actually lives. If this kind of conversation is the one you keep coming back to, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means more of this reaches people who need it. Like the video, if it was worth your time. And the hype button that appears after the like, use it if you want. That is all.